Good evening, everyone. This is Joanne Chestnut coming to you from my home to yours. I'm back again tonight to follow up with my other video yesterday. Yesterday, I talked to you about your gifts and how to bring them out and what we need to be doing in this season while we are coming out of this COVID, because we are coming out of it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a couple of different types of trauma. First, I want to talk to you about something called adverse childhood experiences. This is trauma and events that can have negative, long-lasting effects on your health, well-being, thought process, or relationships. So it's childhood events like abuse, being in the house of someone who did drugs, being in the house of someone who constantly went to jail, seeing your mother or father get physically abused, being physically abused yourself. When you see me looking, it's because there's a sheet here that says adverse childhood experiences. It's a questionnaire and it has 10 questions. And sometimes doctors give these questionnaires when they're trying to discover what kind of trauma a person has been through, because they find that some of the things that people have gone through on this list, if your number is high, it says now add up your yes answers and this is your ACE score. And they find that some of these childhood trauma or childhood experiences are connected to drug abuse, cigarette smoking, excessive drinking, health problems like lung disease and heart disease. They also looked at how childhood events or childhood trauma or generational trauma, which I'll talk a little bit about, has affected the brain and the development of children who were subject to this. And even as they became adults, those effects are still interfering with their lives today. So a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. It is traumatic events that can have negative, long-lasting effects on health, well-being, thought process, and relationships. So I read that one. This is another one, a type of trauma called transgenerational trauma. It refers to trauma that passes through generations. The thought process is that not only can someone experience trauma, they can pass the symptoms and behavior of trauma survival onto their children, and their children pass it on to their children. So that's stuff we see with people who still have slave mentalities, like slavery, actual slavery or institutionalized slavery and oppression. Our parents have passed some of those things down. Our grandparents passed it to our parents, passed it to our children. Sometimes unknowingly, definitely most of the times unknowingly, their mindsets are mindsets that were built around trauma and oppression. And those behaviors and attitudes and thought process and perceptions have passed down to families. Another type of trauma that I want to address is intergenerational trauma. This is almost like transgenerational trauma, but transgenerational trauma is the result of events that happen that affect a whole generation, and it crossed generations. Like the results of the Vietnam War. We know that after the Vietnam War, many of those men who came back from war, that is during a time when drugs, heroin came into our country, and many of those people at that time in the 60s and the early 70s were hooked and got, depended on drugs because that's how they were healing. They came back and they were rejected. They were not cared for as veterans when they came back, and that passed down from fathers to sons, from fathers to the wives, that they had to deal with this trauma. Intergenerational trauma, on the other hand, refers to trauma seen within a family in which grandparents, parents, brothers, or sisters were traumatized, and subsequent generations of that family continue to experience that trauma in some form. This is like recidivism, like going back and forth. Sometimes you see a dad went back and forth to jail all the time, and then his son goes back and forth to jail. Then the son's son does it, or fathers who do it, and their nephews do it. And, it's a generational curse. People who sell drugs, you might see that in a line of family. The uncle sold drugs, the nephew sells drugs, and the nephew's son sells drugs. Or drug abusers. You see that curse of drug abuse, and I call it a curse because in spiritual vernacular, intergenerational trauma, we call those generational curses, right? And even transgenerational trauma, if you really look at that, we're talking about curses that pass from one person or one generation or one family to the other. Okay, I want to read from excerpt from this book. This is John Osteen's. I'm sorry, he's Joel Osteen's dad. It says, "You can change your destiny." And I just want to read a small excerpt from here, okay? It says, dare to do the impossible. Dare to do what the devil and circumstances say you cannot do. I read the story of a dog that had the habit of chasing cars. His master decided to chain him to a tree. The dog had a hard time getting used to this limitation. He raced out after cars only to come abruptly to the end of the chain. It jerked his head terribly time and time again. He finally gave up. He decided he could just go so far and no further. He would walk out to the end of the chain and stop. He knew by bitter experience that this was as far as he could go. He was trapped. He was limited. He was unhappy. But it was impossible for him to go one step further. One day, his master felt that he had learned his lesson, so he patted the dog on the head and at the same time unbuckled the collar around his neck. The dog still stayed there, even though he was loosed from the collar. His master knew that he could bound out of it now with one leap. But do you know what the dog did? He continued to walk out to his former limits and sit and longed for freedom. He could still feel the collar and did not realize his master had loosened it. Little did he know that all he had to do was take one step beyond what he felt was his limitations to discover his deliverance. He had to go one step further and he would have realized that he could go further, but he was conditioned to being stuck. But there he sits, sad and dejected, freed but not free, delivered but not enjoying it. All he needs to do is act. Many of you are like that. For years you have had sickness, fears, and limitations. Bitter experiences apart from God's power have convinced you that you can do just so much and no more. But now you have read the gospel. You know the good news. Your master came all the way from heaven to let the oppressed go free. He came to set the captives free. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. His living words now are, rise, take up thy bed and walk. Be thou made whole. Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. I thought that was so powerful because sometimes we're only tied and bound by our old behaviors, our old thoughts, our old limitations. We hadn't even realized that we are past our limitations. And the other thing, as the little book said, is we hadn't realized that God's power is bigger than our limitations. Our limitations don't stop God. God is not stopped in our limitations. He needs our hearts to change and our mindsets to change. See, because you are moved by what's in your heart. Thoughts come and go, right? Thoughts come and they leave. But what's in your heart is what is moving you, okay? So I wanted to read this little excerpt from the Bible. I'm in Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. It says, a time for everything. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So I guess what we need to be really realizing now is we're in a different time. So I submit to you this question: what time are you in? Don't be limited like the dog on the video. Don't be limited to what you think you can do from your previous limitations. Don't let that happen. Don't allow your former thought process, your former transgenerational trauma, childhood trauma to hold you back from your destiny today. Someone told me a story before about a man who lived in the neighborhood and he had a dog that he sat on the porch every day, and he had a dog that sat on the porch with him. And he had a neighbor that would walk by every single day. And the neighbor would stop and talk to the man on the porch with his dog, and the dog would always be moaning. So one day the neighbor said to the man who owned the dog, he said, "How come every time I come by here, your dog is moaning?" The dog owner said, "Because he's sitting on a nail and it's hurting him." The neighbor said, "Well, why doesn't he just get up?" The dog owner said, I guess it ain't hurting them enough. And sometimes we got to get to that point where we are is hurting us enough that we got to be somewhere else. We got to be pushed beyond that. So many of us have so much in us to offer, and we don't know what it is. Even our children. Look at your children and see what they're doing. I can tell you, my husband is a aerospace engineer and works for one of the top companies in the country. And he told me a story one time that when he was a child, that his mom bought a bicycle for his sister. And he said as he might have been like 5 years old, he said as he sat and he looked and he sat and he looked at the bike and he just knew he could take it apart and put it back together. A brand new bike. Sister hadn't even had a chance to ride it. So he decided, I'm going to go on and take this bike apart. So of course, you know what happens in the Black family, right? He took that bike apart and mama was on 38 hot, right? But he tells me as a part of the story that when he was about to get a whooping, or I think he may have gotten a whooping, I don't know the whole story, but I know that he was either going to get a whooping and he got a whooping. And someone close to his mom said to his mom, you may not want to whoop him for that because he might be onto something. That might be his gift. And so I was talking to him the other day and I said, he since have gone into the military and mastered that craft. And I said, baby, the military helped you enhance the skill. They increased your knowledge with book knowledge, and they help you enhance the skill with professionalism and learning the ins and outs of it. But the gift came from God. We know that because you had it when you were a child before you ever stepped in the military. So they took what you had and helped you make it better. But imagine how long ago that gift was inside of him. How long ago that gift was realized by someone who was speaking to his mom. And many of us have gifts that's hiding inside of us just like that. And we have to figure out what time we are in. Like the book said, it's a time and place for everything. What time are we in? What time is it for you? Because I know for me, it's a time to move some. It's a time to do something. Whatever it is. Yesterday, I mentioned only a couple of businesses. I know we got COVID. I could hear people now, the naysayers. Open a barbershop. How are we going to open a barbershop? We can't. Listen, think about what you can do, not what you can't. Be the first barbershop that opened after COVID that got all the perimeters in place. I see all these folks sewing masks now. Where you been? Because we've been getting everything from China for a long time. Where you been? If you could sew masks, you could sew clothes. Where's your clothing line at? People who cook like nobody's business. Where's your restaurant? If you don't want to do a restaurant, where's your plates of food that we can get on Sundays? Do what it is you do. Figure out what your gift is. It's been in there for a long time. It's not new. It's old. But we have to get away from the adverse childhood experiences. My niece is an attorney, and she is just about to graduate from Harvard University. She is proof that we can be resilient. Resiliency is to bounce back after adversity, to come back. And my niece is living proof of that because she's about to be a Harvard grad and she didn't have no perfect life by far. But you see, she was able to take that gift that God gave her, the gift of hope. You never know who's watching you because, she told me a long time ago, Auntie, I was watching you for a long time because you were the first one in the family to finish college and I've been watching you. Somebody's watching you. I remember one of my friends visit me a long time ago when I first was starting nursing school. I may have been finishing it. She was a cop and came to me and said, I've been thinking about going back to school for law. I said, girl, go do it. I know you got it in you. She said, yeah, you're inspiring me. She's one of the top lawyers now in Boston, running things, doing stuff, running it. Because you never know what you are capable of doing until you step out and do it. So I'm gonna stay at y'all to step out. I want to see some visions. Never mind, keep doing vision boards. When they gonna jump off the board and become reality boards? When we gonna do something for real? We can't keep making vision boards. We can't even keep crying about this police hate and brutality. What we can do, though, is begin to explode. It's a time for us. We can begin to explode exponentially. Let's move something, y'all. Let's do it. Let's not be bound. We are loose. We are free. Let's act like it. No matter what they act like, because they're going to treat us in the way they want to treat us or see us in the way they want to see us. We can't see through their eyes, and we don't need to. But we got our own eyes to see who we are for ourselves. Ask yourself the question today, who am I and what's my gift? And make sure that you don't leave it on the table. Don't leave nothing on the table. Go get yours. This is my 15 minutes of faith. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure am getting something out of giving it to you. I will see you guys again. You know, I always say, if it is the Lord's will, I will see you guys tomorrow. Be blessed.